Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Machiavelli didn't just theorize about power from some dusty library. He watched it happen, up close. And the man he watched most carefully was someone history remembers as a villain, Cesare Borgia, son of a pope, commander of armies before he turned 25, a man who lied, betrayed, and killed his way across Italy. And Machiavelli was right there, sent as a diplomat to his court.
Not once, multiple times. Florence kept sending him back because they needed to understand what Borgia was doing. And what Borgia was doing was terrifying. He was winning.
See, Machiavelli doesn't hold Borgia up as a moral example. He's not saying, be like this man because he was good. He's saying something far more dangerous. He's saying Borgia understood how power actually works, not how it should work, not how priests and philosophers wish it worked.
And the key thing Borgia understood: people respond to decisive action. He didn't negotiate endlessly, he didn't form committees. When he conquered the Romagna, a lawless, chaotic region, he installed a brutal enforcer named Ramiro di Orco to restore order. Di Orco did exactly what was asked: crushed dissent, established control, made people fear the authority. And then Borgia had him killed, cut in half and displayed in the town square.
Machiavelli describes this almost clinically, because the move was calculated. Borgia let de Orco do the dirty work, let him absorb all the hatred, and then eliminated him publicly. The message was clear. The cruelty wasn't mine. I'm the one who stopped it. And just like that, the people's anger shifted. They didn't hate Borgia. They were grateful. That's not madness. That's strategy.
Machiavelli argues this is exactly the kind of thinking a ruler needs. Not because cruelty is good, but because the world doesn't reward hesitation. He points out that Borgia's downfall didn't come from being too ruthless. It came from something he couldn't control. His father, Pope Alexander VI, died unexpectedly, and Borgia himself fell gravely ill at the worst possible moment. He couldn't secure his position. His enemies moved, and everything collapsed.
Machiavelli's takeaway: Borgia did almost everything right. He built alliances, he eliminated rivals before they could organize against him, he controlled public perception. The only thing that beat him was fortune, pure blind luck. And even then, Machiavelli suggests he should have planned better for that too.
This is what separates Machiavelli from the moralists. He doesn't ask, was Borgia a good person? He asks, was Borgia effective? And the answer, uncomfortable as it is, was yes, until fate intervened. But here's the part people miss. Machiavelli isn't celebrating Borgia. He's studying him, the way a surgeon studies a disease. You don't admire the disease, but you'd be a fool not to understand it. He warns that rulers who refuse to learn from men like Borgia, who turn away because the methods are ugly, those rulers lose every time, because their enemies won't share their squeamishness. And that's the real tension in The Prince. Machiavelli keeps presenting these brutal case studies, not because he loves brutality, but because he's watched firsthand what happens to leaders who pretend the world is gentler than it is. They get destroyed. So when people call Machiavelli evil for admiring Borgia, they're missing the point entirely. He didn't admire the man, he admired the competence, and he was honest enough to say so, even when it made everyone uncomfortable. That honesty is exactly what made him dangerous. Here's the thing about Machiavelli. Most people who use his name as an insult have never read a single page he wrote, not one. They heard the ends justify the means somewhere, maybe a movie, maybe a podcast, maybe some guy at a dinner party trying to sound smart, and they ran with it, built an entire image of the man around a phrase he never actually said. That's worth repeating. Machiavelli never wrote the ends justify the means. Not in The Prince,
not in his discourses, not anywhere. It's a paraphrase, a loose, distorted interpretation that got passed down through centuries, like a bad game of telephone. And it's stuck because it's convenient, because it lets people reduce a complex thinker to a cartoon villain. So what did he actually write? The Prince is not a manual for tyrants. It's a survival guide. Machiavelli wrote it in 1513, after being tortured and exiled by the very people he'd served for over a decade. He wasn't sitting in some ivory tower theorizing about power. He was a disgraced public servant, broke, desperate, trying to claw his way back into relevance. And he wrote the most honest book about politics anyone had ever seen. He argues that a ruler must understand the world as it is, not as it should be. That's the core of it. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake, not manipulation as a hobby, but a cold, clear-eyed assessment of how power actually works. He warns that leaders who chase idealism without understanding reality will destroy themselves and everyone who depends on them. But people skip that part. They jump straight to the chapters about fear and deception and think they've got the whole picture. They don't. Machiavelli also wrote the Discourses on Livy, a massive work on republican government, on liberty, on how free states maintain themselves. He argues passionately for civic virtue, for the importance of institutions, for the idea that a republic is superior to a principality. This is the same man people call a champion of dictators. He spent more pages defending republics than he ever spent advising princes. But nobody talks about the Discourses, because it doesn't fit the story. The story is simpler if Machiavelli is just the scheming advisor, whispering poison into the ears of kings. The reality is messier. He was a Republican who wrote a handbook for autocrats, not because he loved autocracy, but because he understood that sometimes, in certain conditions, that's what the situation demands. He wasn't endorsing it, he was describing it, and that distinction matters. See, most political thinkers before Machiavelli dealt in fantasy. They wrote about ideal states, perfect rulers, utopian visions. Plato had his philosopher kings. Augustine had his city of God. Beautiful ideas, completely useless in practice. Machiavelli breaks from all of that. He points out that there is a gap, a massive, dangerous gap, between how people live and how they ought to live. And anyone who ignores that gap in favor of what should be over what is will learn their lesson the hard way. That's not evil, that's honesty. Uncomfortable, unwelcome honesty. So when someone calls another person Machiavellian, what they usually mean is cunning, manipulative, amoral. But what Machiavelli actually advocates is something different: pragmatism, adaptability. The willingness to look at human nature without flinching and make decisions accordingly. He didn't write a book about how to be cruel. He wrote a book about what happens when you refuse to see the world clearly. And 500 years later, people are still proving his point by misreading him. Machiavelli didn't become history's most hated political thinker because of what he wrote. He became it because of who he threatened: the Catholic Church. See, for centuries, the Church had a monopoly on one thing more powerful than armies, more powerful than gold: moral authority. They decided what was right, what was wrong, what was virtuous, and most importantly, they decided who got to rule and why. Kings didn't just sit on thrones because they were strong. They sat there because the Church said God wanted them there. That was the deal. Power flowed from heaven, through the Pope, down to the crown, and everyone played along. Because if you didn't, you were a heretic, and heretics burned. Then Machiavelli comes along, and he doesn't just challenge the system, he ignores it entirely. In The Prince, he doesn't talk about divine right. He doesn't talk about God's plan for rulers. He doesn't even pretend that morality,
the church's version of it, has anything to do with how power actually works. He strips it all away, and what's left is something the church could never allow people to see: the raw machinery of control, how leaders gain power, how they keep it, how they lose it, and none of it, not a single part of it, requires God's approval.
That was the threat. Not that Machiavelli was teaching people to be evil, but that he was teaching them to see clearly. And a population that sees clearly is a population the church can't control. So they did what powerful institutions always do when someone exposes their game. They destroyed his reputation. In 1559, the Catholic Church placed the prince on the Index of Prohibited Books, banned, officially condemned.
And they didn't stop there. They launched a campaign to associate Machiavelli's name with everything sinful. The term Old Nick, a common English nickname for the devil, is widely believed to come from Niccolò Machiavelli himself. That's not an accident. That's a branding exercise. The church didn't just want people to disagree with him. They wanted people to fear him, to recoil at his name the way they'd recoil at blasphemy. And it worked.
For centuries, Machiavellian became synonymous with deception, cruelty, manipulation. The man who wrote one of the most honest political texts in history got turned into a cartoon villain, not because he lied, but because he told the truth about how power operates, and that truth made the people in charge very uncomfortable. But here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli wasn't anti-religion. He actually respected it as a tool. He argues in the Discourses that religion is essential for keeping a society together. That shared beliefs, rituals, and moral codes bind people in ways that laws alone can't. He admired how the Romans used religion to maintain civic order. His problem wasn't with faith. His problem was with a church that had become so corrupt, so drunk on its own political power, that it had stopped serving the people and started serving itself. So when the church called him dangerous, they were right. He was dangerous, just not in the way they wanted everyone to believe. He wasn't dangerous because he was immoral. He was dangerous because he could see through them. And that's the real story of how Machiavelli became the villain. Not through his own sins, but through the insecurity of an institution that couldn't afford to let people think for themselves.
Here's the thing most people don't know. The Prince? That wasn't Machiavelli's magnum opus. Not even close. His real masterpiece, the work he poured years into, the one that actually reveals what he believed, is the Discourses on Livy, and almost nobody talks about it. The Prince gets all the fame, all the controversy, all the memes. But the Discourses is where Machiavelli lays out his full political vision, and it's not what you'd expect from history's most infamous villain.
Because in the Discourses, Machiavelli argues passionately for republics, for self-governance, for the power of ordinary citizens to shape their own destiny. That doesn't sound like a tyrant's handbook, does it? The Discourses is structured around the history of the Roman Republic. Machiavelli uses Livy's accounts of Rome not as dusty history lessons, but as a living blueprint. He dissects how Rome rose, how it maintained freedom, and how it eventually lost it.
Every chapter is a case study, every observation a warning. And his central argument is striking. Machiavelli contends that republics, not principalities, are the superior form of government. He argues that when power is shared among the many, the state becomes more resilient, more adaptable, more enduring. A single ruler can be brilliant, but brilliance dies with the man. A republic built on strong institutions outlasts any individual.
He goes further. Machiavelli insists that conflict between social classes, the elites and the common people, isn't a disease, it's a feature. He points to Rome and says, look, the tension between the Senate and the plebs didn't destroy the Republic,
It strengthened it. That friction produced better laws, better checks on power, better outcomes for everyone.
This was radical thinking. In an era where most political theorists preached harmony and obedience, Machiavelli embraced disorder. He argues that a little chaos keeps institutions honest, that when the people push back against the powerful, freedom survives. And when they stop pushing, that's when tyranny creeps in.
But he's not naive about it. Machiavelli warns that republics are fragile. They require something he calls virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but civic energy, courage, engagement, the willingness of citizens to fight for their institutions, to sacrifice personal comfort for the common good. The moment people become lazy, corrupt, or indifferent, the republic is already dying. It just doesn't know it yet.
He also makes a point that still cuts deep today. Machiavelli argues that the greatest threat to a republic isn't an external enemy, it's internal decay. It's ambitious men who exploit public office for private gain. It's citizens who trade freedom for comfort. It's the slow, quiet rot that happens when people stop caring about the system that protects them.
So why does nobody talk about this? Why is Machiavelli remembered as the author of a cynical playbook for dictators, and not as one of the earliest, most forceful defenders of republican government? Part of the answer is simple. The Prince is short, provocative, easy to misquote. The Discourses is long, dense. It demands patience, and nuance doesn't trend.
But the bigger reason is that it's easier to make Machiavellian a villain. It's convenient. It lets people dismiss uncomfortable truths about power without actually engaging with them. Slap the label Machiavellian on something, and the conversation's over. No thinking required. Machiavelli deserved better than that. The Discourses proves it. This wasn't a man who worshipped power for its own sake. This was a man who understood power, every ugly angle of it, and still chose to argue that the people should hold it.
Here's the thing most people get wrong about Machiavelli. They read The Prince and assume he's writing a manual, a how-to guide for dictators. Step 1, lie. Step 2, crush your enemies. Step 3, rule forever. But that reading is lazy, and it misses something critical. Machiavelli wasn't inventing these tactics. He was describing what was already happening every single day, in every court across Italy, across Europe, across the ancient world. He just had the nerve to write it down, and that's what made him unforgivable.
See, before Machiavelli, political writing was dressed up in morality. Philosophers wrote about the ideal state, the just king, the virtuous ruler guided by God and goodness. It sounded beautiful, and it had almost nothing to do with reality. Machiavelli looked at that tradition and said, "Enough." He argues in The Prince that the gap between how people live and how they ought to live is so wide that anyone who ignores what is actually done in favor of what should be done learns their destruction rather than their preservation. That's not cynicism, that's observation. He had spent decades watching Italian politics, watching alliances form and shatter, watching good men lose everything because they played by rules their opponents had already abandoned. So he stopped pretending.
And this is where the bread and circuses idea becomes essential. Machiavelli didn't coin the phrase, that goes back to the Roman poet Juvenal, but the concept runs through everything he writes. He understood that power doesn't just operate through force, it operates through perception, through spectacle, through giving people just enough to keep them quiet.
He points out that a prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, honest, and religious. Appear, not necessarily be, because the masses don't interact with their ruler directly. They see what he shows them. They believe what he performs. and a smart ruler controls that performance carefully. Now, is that evil, or is that just how every government in history has functioned? Machiavelli argues it's the latter.
He's not saying rulers should deceive people because deception is fun. He's saying they already do, they always have, and the only people who don't see it are the ones being deceived. That's the part that stings, because The Prince isn't really a guidebook for tyrants. Tyrants don't need a guidebook. They already know these things instinctively. The Prince is a guidebook for everyone else. It's Machiavelli pulling back the curtain and saying, look, this is how it's done. This is what your leaders are doing while they smile at you and talk about justice. He warns that people are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that the one who deceives will always find those willing to be deceived. That's not an endorsement. That's a warning. He's telling ordinary people to wake up, to stop being so trusting, to recognize the machinery behind the performance. And this is why the powerful hated him, not because he taught manipulation, but because he exposed it. He took the tricks that rulers kept hidden, the careful image management, the strategic generosity, the calculated mercy, and he laid them out in plain language anyone could read. The church banned the book. Princes denounced it. For centuries, his name was synonymous with evil. But ask yourself, who benefits from calling Machiavelli dangerous? The people being manipulated, or the people doing the manipulating? The answer tells you everything. Machiavelli didn't create the game. He just refused to let it stay invisible. And for that, they made him the villain, which, if you think about it, proves his point better than anything he ever wrote. Machiavelli has one of the most striking metaphors in all of political philosophy. He compares fortune, fate, luck, circumstance, whatever you want to call it, to a violent river. When it floods, it destroys everything. Towns, fields, lives. Nobody can stand against it in the moment. But here's his point. Before the flood comes, you can build defenses, dams, channels, barriers. The people who prepare survive. The people who don't get swept away. That's not fatalism. That's the opposite of fatalism. He argues that fortune controls roughly half of human affairs. Half. The other half belongs to us, to our preparation, our decisions, our willingness to act. And most people waste that half. They sit around waiting for conditions to be perfect, for the right moment, for some sign from the universe that it's safe to move. Machiavelli has no patience for that. He warns that the man who relies entirely on fortune will be ruined the moment fortune shifts, and it always shifts. This is where he gets ruthless in his honesty. He points out that people are, by nature, creatures of habit. They find a method that works, and they cling to it. The cautious leader stays cautious, the aggressive leader stays aggressive, and for a while it works, because circumstances happen to favor their temperament. But circumstances change, and the leader who cannot change with them is finished. He uses Pope Julius II as an example. Julius was impetuous, bold to the point of recklessness, and it worked brilliantly because the times called for exactly that kind of energy. But Machiavelli argues that if Julius had lived longer, if the situation had demanded patience and diplomacy, he would have failed because he couldn't adapt. His nature was fixed, and a fixed nature in a shifting world is a death sentence. That's the trap most people fall into, not just rulers, everyone. They mistake a temporary alignment between who they are and what the moment requires for some kind of permanent truth. They think, this is who I am, and it works, and they never question it until it stops working, and by then, it's too late. Machiavelli argues that the ideal leader, if such a person could exist, would be able to shift between caution and boldness as the situation demands. But he's honest enough to admit that almost nobody can do this. Human beings are stubborn.
They'd rather fail doing what's familiar than succeed doing what's uncomfortable, and fortune punishes that stubbornness without mercy. There's something else in his metaphor that people miss. The river doesn't care. Fortune is not a moral force. It doesn't reward the virtuous or punish the wicked. It simply moves, and it moves indifferently. Machiavelli strips away any comforting notion that the universe has a plan, that things happen for a reason, that good people get good outcomes. They don't. Not automatically, not reliably. The only edge anyone has is preparation and the willingness to act decisively when the moment arrives. And he goes further. He argues that it's better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune, he says, favors those who force the issue over those who proceed timidly. The bold make mistakes, sure, but the cautious miss opportunities entirely, and a missed opportunity is just a slow form of failure. That's what makes his view of fortune so unsettling. It's not comforting. There's no safety net in Machiavelli's world, no cosmic justice, just the river rising. And the only question that matters is whether you built your defenses before the water came, or whether you stood on the bank hoping it wouldn't rain. This is where Machiavelli loses most people, and it's where most people get him wrong. He doesn't say morality doesn't matter. He says it doesn't always win. And if you're a leader, someone responsible for the survival of a state, an army, a population, you don't get the luxury of being good all the time. You get the luxury of staying alive. That's it. Machiavelli draws a hard line in The Prince. He argues that a ruler must learn how not to be good, not because evil is desirable, but because the world doesn't reward virtue the way Sunday school promised it would. Good leaders who refuse to get their hands dirty, they get overthrown, they get invaded, they get replaced by someone who was willing to do what they weren't, and their people pay the price. That's the part critics always skip. Machiavelli isn't celebrating cruelty for its own sake. He's pointing out a cost, the cost of being noble in a game where your opponents aren't. And he's asking a question most moral philosophers don't want to touch. What do you owe your people, your principles, or their safety? He uses Cesare Borgia as an example. Borgia was ruthless, violent, unquestionably brutal. But Machiavelli points out that the lands Borgia controlled became more stable, more orderly, more peaceful than they'd been under supposedly good rulers who let chaos reign because they didn't have the stomach for hard decisions. The people under Borgia's rule weren't living in fear. They were living in order. And order, Machiavelli argues, is what people actually need, not a leader's clean conscience. Now compare that to someone like Piero Soderini, the man who led Florence before Machiavelli's world fell apart. Soderini was decent, patient, fair, everything you'd want in a leader if you were writing a children's book. But he was weak. He refused to act against his enemies when he had the chance. He tried to be liked instead of being effective. And in 1512, when the Medici came back with Spanish soldiers at their side, Soderini didn't fight. He stepped aside. Florence lost its republic. And Machiavelli, the man who had served that republic loyally, lost everything: his position, his freedom, his purpose. So when Machiavelli writes about the necessity of hard choices, he's not theorizing. He watched a good man's weakness destroy everything he cared about. That changes you. He warns that the gap between how people live and how they ought to live is so wide that anyone who ignores what is actually done in favor of what should be done learns their destruction rather than their preservation. Read that again. He's not telling leaders to abandon morality. He's telling them to stop pretending the world operates on it. And this is where the real tension lives. Machiavelli doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't say, do the wrong thing and feel fine about it. He acknowledges the weight. He knows it's ugly. But he argues that a leader who lets their state collapse because they wanted to feel righteous has failed at the only job that matters, protecting the people who depend on them. Morality is a luxury for those who aren't under threat. That's his position. And it's brutal, but it's not evil. It's the recognition that survival and ethics don't always shake hands. And when they don't, when the choice is between being good and being gone, Machiavelli says the answer should be obvious. You survive first, then you worry about your soul. Machiavelli's influence didn't stay locked inside political theory. It bled into everything: literature, military strategy, governance. The man's ideas spread across centuries like a slow-burning fire. And the people they touched? Not exactly nobodies. Shakespeare knew Machiavelli. Not personally, obviously. But the ideas? They're all over his work. Richard III, Iago, Lady Macbeth. These aren't just great villains. They're Machiavellian archetypes, characters who understand that power doesn't wait for permission, who manipulate appearances, exploit trust, and move through the world with calculated precision. Shakespeare didn't just borrow Machiavelli's ideas, he dramatized them, turned political philosophy into theater that audiences still watch 500 years later. And here's what's interesting. Shakespeare never reduces these characters to simple evil. They're compelling, magnetic even, because Shakespeare understood what Machiavelli understood, that the mechanics of power are fascinating precisely because they're uncomfortable. You're not supposed to root for Iago, but you can't look away from him either. Then there's Napoleon, and Napoleon didn't just read The Prince. He studied it, annotated it, reportedly kept a copy at his bedside. This wasn't casual reading. This was a military commander and emperor treating a 16th century political treatise like an operational manual. And it shows. Napoleon's approach to governance, his ability to read rooms, shift alliances, project strength while concealing weakness, mirrors Machiavelli's prescriptions almost exactly. Machiavelli argues that a leader must know when to be loved and when to be feared. Napoleon lived that principle. He could inspire fanatical loyalty in his soldiers one moment and crush dissent with cold efficiency the next. He understood the performance of power, the spectacle, the image. But Napoleon also proved something else Machiavelli warned about: overreach. Machiavelli cautions that even the most capable prince must respect the limits of fortune, that ambition unchecked by prudence leads to ruin. Napoleon didn't listen to that part. Moscow, Waterloo, exile. The arc of Napoleon's fall reads like a case study Machiavelli could have written himself. And it wasn't just these two. The founding fathers of America, Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, were deeply influenced by Machiavelli's political thought, particularly the Discourses. The idea that a republic needs institutional checks, that power must be distributed, that civic engagement is the lifeblood of freedom, these weren't just Enlightenment ideas. Machiavelli had laid that groundwork centuries earlier. Even the structure of the American system, the separation of powers, the tension between branches of government, echoes Machiavelli's argument that productive conflict between classes strengthens a republic. He would have looked at the American Constitution and recognized his own fingerprints. Frederick the Great of Prussia publicly wrote an entire treatise called Anti-Machiavel, condemning the prince as immoral. And then, he governed like a Machiavellian through and through. Ruthless diplomacy, strategic warfare, calculated alliances. The gap between what Frederick said about Machiavelli and what he actually did is almost poetic, and Machiavelli would have appreciated the irony. He argues, after all, that leaders will always say one thing and do another. Frederick just proved him right. So what does all this tell us?
That Machiavelli wasn't some obscure theorist gathering dust in a library. His ideas shaped the people who shaped history. Generals followed his logic. Playwrights dramatized his insights. Nation builders borrowed his blueprints. And even the ones who publicly rejected him couldn't escape his influence. That's not the legacy of a villain. That's the legacy of someone who saw the world with such brutal clarity that the powerful couldn't ignore him, even when they wanted to.
Most people who hate Machiavelli have never read him. They've heard the quotes, the sound bites. It is better to be feared than loved. And they stop right there. Case closed. The man was a monster. But they never finish the sentence. Machiavelli actually writes that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. That qualifier changes everything. He's not saying fear is the goal. He's saying that in an imperfect world where you're forced to choose, fear is more reliable than love, because love is fickle. People break promises when it suits them, but fear holds. He warns, though, and this is the part nobody mentions, that a prince must avoid being hated. Fear is useful, hated is fatal. There's a line, and Machiavelli draws it clearly. A ruler who steals from his people, who takes their property, who violates their families, that ruler is finished. Not eventually, soon. Because hatred breeds conspiracy, and conspiracy breeds assassination. So no, the prince is not a blank check for cruelty. Machiavelli argues that cruelty, when it must be used, should be applied all at once and then abandoned, not dragged out, not savored, quick, decisive, and done, so that people can begin to recover, and the ruler can shift to generosity. He calls this well-used cruelty, not because cruelty is ever good, but because if it's inevitable, there's a less destructive way to apply it. Compare that to what people think he said. They imagine he's endorsing torture chambers and political purges for sport. He's doing the opposite. He's saying, if you must be harsh, do it once, do it fast, and then govern well. Prolonged cruelty is not strategy, it's stupidity. And then there's the chapter on generosity. Machiavelli makes a counterintuitive argument. He says a prince who tries to be generous will eventually ruin himself, because generosity requires money. Money requires taxes. Taxes breed resentment, and eventually the generous ruler becomes the oppressor, squeezing his people dry to maintain an image of largesse. He points out that it's better to be thought miserly at first and then govern responsibly than to bankrupt the state chasing a reputation for kindness. That's not evil, that's fiscal realism, but it sounds cold, and cold is enough to get you condemned. The prince also spends significant time on military strategy, something modern readers skip entirely. Machiavelli argues passionately that a ruler must never rely on mercenary soldiers. They're disloyal. They fight for money, not conviction, and when the money runs out, they switch sides or disappear. He'd seen this happen to Florence repeatedly, hired armies that failed at every critical moment. He insists a prince must build a citizen army, people who fight for their own land, their own families. That's not manipulation. That's common sense, born from watching mercenaries destroy Italian independence for decades. But none of this fits the caricature. The cartoon Machiavelli, the scheming villain twirling his mustache, doesn't survive contact with the actual text. The real Machiavelli is pragmatic, yes, unsentimental, absolutely, but he's also specific, measured, almost surgical in distinguishing what works from what doesn't. He doesn't say, do whatever you want. He says, understand the costs of every choice. There's a difference, a massive one. And the failure to recognize that difference is exactly how a sharp political analyst got turned into a boogeyman. The Prince isn't a celebration of darkness. It's a manual for surviving in a world that already is dark.
and Machiavelli respected his readers enough to stop pretending otherwise. Machiavelli makes a claim that sounds brutal, but is backed by every century of history since he wrote it. He states, plainly, that all armed prophets have conquered, and all unarmed prophets have failed. No exceptions, no caveats, just the raw pattern. He uses Savonarola as his prime example. Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who seized control of Florence through sheer force of personality. He preached against corruption, against the Medici, against the moral decay of the church. And people listened. For a while, he practically ruled the city. No army, no weapons, just words and conviction, and the fire of a man who believed God was on his side. And then they burnt him at the stake.
Machiavelli doesn't bring this up to mock Savonarola. He brings it up to make a point. Savonarola had no way to enforce belief. He could inspire people, he could terrify them with visions of damnation, but the moment public opinion shifted, and it always shifts, he had nothing to fall back on. No force, no leverage, nothing but a reputation that was already crumbling.
He argues that Savonarola's failure wasn't a matter of bad luck or bad timing. It was structural, built into the very foundation of his power, because power built on persuasion alone is power built on sand. Then he points to Moses. Same mission, leading people, transforming a society, establishing new laws. But Moses had force behind him. When persuasion failed, when the people doubted, when they built their golden calf and turned their backs on everything he taught them, Moses didn't give another sermon. He acted.
Machiavelli argues that this is what separates the prophets who endure from the ones who get destroyed, not the quality of their vision, the ability to compel obedience when vision isn't enough. And this is where people get uncomfortable, because the implication is clear. Ideas alone don't change the world. Moral authority alone doesn't hold power. You can be right about everything, every policy, every principle, every reform, and still lose, still get overthrown, still watch everything you built collapse, because being right is not the same as being strong.
Machiavelli warns that introducing new orders is the most dangerous enterprise a leader can undertake. The innovator makes enemies of everyone who benefited from the old system, and the people who would benefit from the new system, they're lukewarm at best, skeptical, hesitant. They won't fight for you until they've already seen the new order work. But you can't make it work without their support. That's the trap. And the only way out of it is force. Not necessarily violence, but the credible capacity to enforce your will when persuasion runs dry. He points out that the supply is far beyond politics. Any new idea, any disruption, any attempt to change an established order faces the same dynamic. The defenders of the status quo are organized, motivated, and ruthless. The supporters of change are scattered, uncertain, and unreliable. And the person standing in the middle, trying to drag the world forward, had better have more than good arguments. This is one of Machiavelli's hardest lessons, and one of his most ignored. People want to believe that truth wins on its own merits, that justice prevails because it's just, that the right idea, spoken clearly enough, will carry the day. He rejects all of that. Not because he doesn't value truth or justice, but because he's watched, firsthand, in the streets of Florence and the courts of Italy, what happens to people who confuse moral clarity with actual power. They end up like Savonarola, ashes. Machiavelli tells a story in The Prince that most readers remember long after they've forgotten everything else. It's about Cesare Borgia and a man named Ramiro de Orco, and it's one of the coldest political moves ever documented. Here's what happened. Borgia had just taken control of the Romagna,
a region that was lawless, violent, barely governable. He needed order, fast. So he appointed Ramiro de Orco, a notoriously cruel and efficient enforcer, to do the dirty work. And Ramiro did exactly that. He cracked down hard. Brutal punishments, swift justice, no mercy. Within a short time, the region was pacified. Order was restored. The job was done.
But now Borgia had a problem. The people hated Ramiro. They feared him. And that hatred was starting to bleed toward Borgia himself. So what does Borgia do? He has Ramiro killed, cut in two, body displayed in the public square with a bloody knife beside it. The message was clear. That man was the monster, not me, and I dealt with him for you. Machiavelli doesn't flinch telling this story. He presents it almost with admiration, not because he loves violence, but because he recognizes the precision of it. Borgia used Ramiro to accomplish what needed to be done. Then he used Ramiro's death to distance himself from the consequences. One move solved two problems. Order was established, and Borgia's hands looked clean.
Now, before you dismiss this as some medieval horror show, take a second, because this exact tactic is alive and well. It happens in boardrooms, in governments, in every institution that needs to make unpopular decisions but can't afford to be the face of them. A CEO hires a turnaround specialist to gut the workforce. Layoffs happen, morale collapses, and once the blood's been stilled, the specialist is let go. The new CEO steps in with a message of healing and fresh starts. The company moves forward. Nobody blames the person at the top. They blame the one who got fired. Politicians do it constantly. An advisor takes the fall for a failed policy. A cabinet member resigns to absorb the scandal. A general gets blamed for a war the president authorized. The pattern is always the same. Let someone else carry the sin, then sacrifice them publicly to wash yourself of it.
Machiavelli argues this isn't just clever, it's necessary, because a leader who personally absorbs every unpopular decision eventually becomes the target of everyone's resentment, and resentment, left unchecked, turns into revolt. The scapegoat isn't just a victim. The scapegoat is a pressure valve, a way to release the anger of the people without it destroying the state. Is it fair? No. Machiavelli doesn't care about fair. He cares about what works. And what works is giving people someone to blame, someone who isn't you.
But here's where it gets uncomfortable. He's not describing a flaw in human nature he hopes will fix. He's describing a permanent feature. People need villains. They need someone to hold responsible when things go wrong. And if a leader doesn't provide one, the people will choose one on their own, usually the leader. So Machiavelli's advice is simple. Control the narrative. If the ugly work has to be done, delegate it. And when it's over, make sure the person who did it becomes the story, not you. Cold? Absolutely. But look at the world around you. This isn't ancient history. This is Monday morning.
Machiavelli had a grudge against mercenaries, and it wasn't theoretical, it was personal. He'd watched it happen, watched Florence, his Florence, hire foreign soldiers to fight its wars, watched those soldiers take the money, drag their feet, and deliver nothing when it mattered. Machiavelli saw firsthand what happens when a state outsources its own survival, and it disgusted him. In The Prince, he's blunt about it. Machiavelli argues that mercenaries are useless. Worse than useless, they're dangerous. He warns that hired soldiers have no loyalty to the state they serve, no skin in the game. They fight when it's easy and vanish when it's hard. And if they're strong enough to win, then you've got a different problem, because now you've built someone else's army, and that army answers to whoever's paying, not to you. He puts it simply, Machiavelli contends that a prince who relies on mercenaries stands on someone else's legs, and legs that aren't yours can walk away whenever they choose. But he doesn't stop at mercenaries. He extends the argument to what he calls auxiliary forces, troops borrowed from a more powerful ally, and he warns that these are even more dangerous. Because mercenaries might abandon you, but auxiliaries, they come with strings. They come with the interests of whoever lent them. Win or lose, you end up in debt to a foreign power. You've traded independence for short-term muscle. And Machiavelli argues that no state can survive long on borrowed strength. This wasn't abstract philosophy. Machiavelli was so convinced of this that he actually did something about it. As Secretary of Florence, he pushed hard to create a citizen militia, an army of Florentines fighting for Florence. Not foreigners, not contractors, people who had something to lose if the city fell. It was a radical idea at the time. Most Italian city-states relied on condottieri, professional mercenary captains who sold their services to the highest bidder. The system was entrenched, comfortable, and Machiavelli argued it was rotting Italy from the inside. He points to the repeated foreign invasions of the Italian peninsula, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire walking in almost unopposed, and says this is what happens. This is the price of outsourcing your defense. You become a playing field for other people's ambitions. And history proved him right, over and over. Look at the modern world through Machiavelli's lens, and the parallels are uncomfortable. Nations that depend on foreign military aid for their security, governments that contract private military companies to fight wars their own citizens won't, alliances where the power balance is so lopsided that one side isn't really an ally, it's a dependent. Machiavelli would have looked at all of it and said the same thing he said 500 years ago. A state that cannot defend itself with its own people is not truly sovereign. It's renting its survival, and rent comes due. There's a deeper point here too. Machiavelli argues that the act of defending your own state, citizens taking up arms for their own land, isn't just militarily practical, it's politically essential. It creates civic bonds, shared sacrifice, a population that fights together, governs together. Strip that away, hand it off to someone else, and you don't just weaken your army, you weaken your republic. This is Machiavelli at his most prophetic. Not scheming, not manipulating, just staring at a broken system and telling everyone exactly why it's broken. And nobody listened then either. Some warnings never go out of date. This is one of them. There's a line from Machiavelli that gets thrown around like confetti at a funeral. Be the lion and the fox. People slap it on motivational posters. They whisper it in boardrooms. They tattoo it on their forearms like it's some ancient war cry. And almost every single one of them gets it wrong. Machiavelli didn't invent this metaphor. He borrowed it. From Cicero, actually, a Roman statesman who used the lion and the fox to describe two types of injustice. Cicero's point was simple. Force is the way of the lion. Fraud is the way of the fox. And both, he argued, are beneath a good man. Both are fundamentally inhuman. Not because it's noble, not because it's right, but because the world doesn't reward nobility, it rewards survival. In Chapter 18 of The Prince, Machiavelli lays it out with zero sentimentality. He argues that a prince who relies only on the lion, on brute strength, on open confrontation, will walk straight into traps. He'll be outmaneuvered by people who smile to his face and scheme behind his back. Pure force is predictable, and predictable men don't last long in politics. But the fox alone isn't enough either. Machiavelli warns that cunning without power is just cleverness with no teeth. You can see every trap coming, but if you don't have the strength to act, what's the point?
you become the person who's always right, but never in charge. So the answer, according to Machiavelli, is both. The fox to recognize the snare, the lion to scatter the wolves. Not one or the other, both, at the same time. And the real skill, the thing that separates a competent leader from a great one, is knowing which to deploy and when. Now, here's the part that 5 centuries of commentary have conveniently ignored. Machiavelli isn't celebrating deception. He's describing a reality. He points out that men, by nature, are not good. They break promises, they act in self-interest, they betray alliances the moment the cost-benefit analysis shifts. And a leader who operates as though people are fundamentally trustworthy, that leader is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. This is what separates Machiavelli from every armchair philosopher who came before him. He refuses to talk about the world as it should be. He talks about the world as it is. And in that world, a prince who keeps every promise, who fights every battle head-on, who never uses misdirection, that prince loses. Not because he's weak, because he's naive. But people don't want to hear that. They'd rather reduce Machiavelli to a villain, a cartoon schemer rubbing his hands together in the dark. So they rip the lion and the fox out of context. They strip away the reasoning. They turn a nuanced argument about political survival into a bumper sticker for sociopaths. Machiavelli deserves better than that. Not because he was a saint, he wasn't, but because he was honest, brutally, uncomfortably honest. He looked at power and described exactly what he saw. No varnish, no prayer, no wishful thinking. And that's what really bothers people. It's not that Machiavelli said something wrong, it's that he said something true. And 500 years later, we're still not mature enough to sit with it. This is the line everyone throws around. The one phrase that's supposed to sum up everything Machiavelli stood for. The ends justify the means. It's on posters, it's in movies, it's the go-to quote for anyone trying to sound ruthlessly intelligent at a dinner party. But here's the thing, he never actually wrote it. Not once. Not in The Prince, not in the Discourses, not in any letter, any play, any diplomatic memo. The exact phrase, the ends justify the means, doesn't exist anywhere in Machiavelli's body of work. And yet, it's the single most attributed idea to his name. So where did it come from? What Machiavelli actually wrote, in chapter 18 of The Prince, is something far more nuanced. He argues that in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no court of appeal, one judges by the result. That's it. That's the line. And it's not a moral blank check. It's an observation, a cold, clear-eyed reading of how power actually works. He's not saying do whatever you want and justify it later. He's saying that history doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about outcomes. The world judges leaders not by what they meant to do, but by what they did. And there's a critical difference between those two ideas. One is a philosophy of reckless abandon. The other is a warning. Machiavelli isn't cheering for tyrants. He's telling you how the game is scored. He's pointing at the scoreboard and saying, this is what matters. Not your speeches, not your promises, the story you tell yourself at night. Results. That's what survives. That's what history remembers. But people don't want nuance. They want villains. And Machiavelli makes a convenient one. A man who dared to describe power without dressing it up in moral language. That's terrifying to people who need their politics wrapped in virtue. So they took his most dangerous observation, simplified it into a bumper sticker, and turned him into a monster. And the irony? The people who misquote him the most are usually the ones who understand power the least. They hear the ends justify the means,
and think it's permission, a green light. But Machiavelli wasn't handing out permission slips. He was issuing a diagnosis. He looked at how rulers actually behaved, not how they should behave in some fantasy, and he wrote it down. That's all. He warns repeatedly that cruelty without purpose is just cruelty, that a leader who abuses power carelessly will lose it, that the people's goodwill is a resource, and burning through it for short-term gain is strategic suicide. None of that sounds like a man who believed anything goes.
So why does the myth persist? Because the myth is useful. It gives people a shorthand for moral corruption. It lets them dismiss one of history's sharpest political thinkers without ever reading a single page of his work. And it protects a comfortable illusion that power and morality are always aligned, that good intentions lead to good outcomes, and that the world plays fair. Machiavelli knew better.
He'd seen the inside of Florentine politics. He'd been imprisoned, tortured, exiled. And after all of it, he sat down and wrote the truth. Not what people wanted to hear, the truth. And the world's been punishing him for it ever since.
There's a line buried in Machiavelli's work that most people have heard some version of. It is better to be feared than loved. And that single line, ripped from context, stripped of nuance, became the verdict. The man was a monster, a villain, the godfather of political evil. But here's the thing. Machiavelli never said cruelty was good. He said weakness disguised as kindness was dangerous. And that distinction matters more than most people realize.
See, Machiavelli wasn't writing from some ivory tower. He wasn't theorizing in the abstract. He was writing from exile, stripped of his position, tortured, broken.
He'd served the Florentine Republic as a diplomat and a strategist, watched leaders rise and fall, studied the mechanics of power up close. And when everything was taken from him, he sat down and wrote The Prince, not as a celebration of tyranny, but as a survival manual, a field guide for rulers who wanted to hold on to power without getting destroyed by those who had none of the same moral hesitations. And that's where the misunderstanding begins.
Machiavelli argues that a ruler who tries to be loved by everyone will eventually be consumed by everyone. He points out that generosity, when practiced without calculation, leads to financial ruin,
which then forces the ruler to raise taxes, which makes him hated anyway. So the leader who starts out trying to be generous ends up more despised than the one who was careful from the beginning. That's not evil, that's arithmetic.
He warns that mercy, applied without discipline, creates chaos. A prince who forgives too freely invites disorder, and disorder harms far more people than a single act of decisive punishment ever could. Machiavelli's argument isn't that compassion is wrong, it's that misplaced compassion has a body count. A leader who refuses to make hard decisions doesn't protect anyone, he just delays the damage, and when it finally comes, it comes worse.
But none of that made it into the popular reading. What survived was the caricature, the scheming, cold-blooded advisor whispering poison into a tyrant's ear. The word Machiavellian itself became shorthand for manipulation, deception, moral bankruptcy, which is ironic, because the man who wrote about the ruthless mechanics of power was by most accounts a patriot, someone who genuinely believed in the stability and strength of his republic. He didn't want chaos. He wanted order, and he understood, better than most of his contemporaries, that order doesn't come from good intentions alone.
He makes this point repeatedly. Intentions are irrelevant if outcomes are catastrophic. A ruler who means well but governs poorly is no different, in Machiavelli's framework, from a ruler who means harm. The people don't eat intentions, they live with consequences. And this is what unsettled people. Not the cruelty, the honesty.
Machiavelli held up a mirror and said, "This is how power actually works." Not how it should work, not how you wish it worked, how it works. And people hated the mirror more than they hated the reality. So when he writes that it is safer to be feared than loved, he's not endorsing terror, he's making an observation. Love is conditional. It depends on the people's mood, their needs, their memory. Fear is structural. It holds even when love fades.
Machiavelli doesn't celebrate that fact. He reports it, the way a doctor reports a diagnosis you didn't want to hear. And that's the tragedy of his legacy. The man who tried to describe the world as it was got condemned for not describing it as people wanted it to be. Here's where Machiavelli gets really dangerous, not because he attacks religion, but because he understands it better than most priests do. Machiavelli doesn't care whether God exists. That's not his department. What he cares about is what belief does to people, how it moves them, how it binds them, how it makes them obedient. And in his hands, that observation becomes one of the most ruthless tools in political history. He looks at ancient Rome, not the church, not Christianity, pagan Rome, and he sees something brilliant. The Romans didn't just worship their gods, they used them. Every military campaign, every law, every public decision was wrapped in religious ritual, not because the senators were devout, but because the people were. Machiavelli points out that Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, understood something critical. You can conquer a people with swords, but you can only govern them with gods. Numa invented rituals, created priestly orders, built temples, not out of faith, but out of necessity, and Rome flourished, not despite the manipulation, because of it. That's the core of Machiavelli's argument. Religion isn't about truth.
It's about function. It's a binding agent. It gives people a shared moral code, a reason to sacrifice, a fear of consequences beyond the law. And a ruler who ignores that power is a fool. But here's the twist. Machiavelli doesn't just admire how Rome used religion. He's furious at how Christianity failed to do the same, at least in the way that serves the state. He argues that Christianity, with its emphasis on humility, suffering, and the afterlife, made men weak. It taught them to endure rather than fight, to turn the other cheek rather than defend the republic.
Pagan religion celebrated strength, glory, and civic duty. Christian religion celebrated meekness, and Machiavelli saw that as a political disaster. He's not saying faith is worthless. He's saying the wrong kind of faith destroys nations. And then there's the church itself. Machiavelli tears into the Catholic Church with a kind of cold precision that's almost shocking for his era. He argues that the church kept Italy divided. It was strong enough to prevent any single ruler from unifying the peninsula, but too weak or too corrupt to do it itself. It meddled in politics without committing to governance. It played kingdoms against each other. And the result? Italy remained fractured, vulnerable, and humiliated by foreign powers. So when Machiavelli talks about religion, he's not being an atheist, he's being a strategist. He sees religion as perhaps the most powerful force available to a ruler, more powerful than armies, more enduring than laws, but only if it's wielded correctly, only if it serves the state, rather than undermining it. He warns that a prince must appear religious. That's non-negotiable. The people need to believe their leader is guided by something higher. But the actual content of that belief, that's flexible. What matters is the effect. Does it unify? Does it motivate? Does it keep order? If yes, then it's useful. If it breeds passivity, division, or corruption, discard it, or reshape it. This is Machiavelli at his most unsettling,
not because he's wrong, but because he strips away every comfortable illusion about faith and power. He treats religion the way an engineer treats a bridge, as a structure that either holds weight or collapses, and he has no patience for anyone who confuses the blueprint with the divine. That's not blasphemy, that's clarity. Here's the thing most people miss about Machiavelli. They read one chapter about cruelty being well used, and they think they've got him figured out. Cold-blooded, ruthless, a man in love with violence. They couldn't be more wrong. Machiavelli's real obsession wasn't cruelty, it was adaptability. The ability to read a room, read an era, read the mood of an entire population, and shift accordingly. He argues again. They find one strategy that works, and they ride it into the ground, and when the world shifts beneath them, because it always does, they shatter. He calls this out explicitly. In chapter 25, Machiavelli makes an argument that most people skip right over. He contends that fortune, what we'd now call circumstances, timing, the sheer randomness of events, governs roughly half of human affairs. The other half? That's on you. Your decisions, your willingness to adapt. And the leaders who thrive aren't the smartest or the strongest. They're the ones whose temperament happens to match the moment. But here's the brutal part. Machiavelli admits that most people can't do this. A cautious man stays cautious even when boldness is required. An aggressive leader keeps pushing even when patience would win the day. Human nature locks people into patterns, and those patterns become prisons. So, what does Machiavelli recommend? He suggests that if a leader must lean one way, lean toward action, toward boldness. He famously compares fortune to a river in flood. You can't stop it, but you can build embankments before the rains come. Preparation meets opportunity. That's not cruelty, that's strategy. And this is where the misreading gets truly frustrating. When Machiavelli talks about cruelty, he's not endorsing it as a lifestyle. He draws a sharp, deliberate line between cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. Well-used cruelty, he argues, is swift, decisive, and done once, at the beginning, to secure stability. Then it stops. Badly used cruelty is the opposite. It escalates over time. It breeds fear without purpose. It turns a ruler into a tyrant that everyone wants dead. Read that distinction carefully. Machiavelli isn't saying cruelty is good. He's saying that if it must happen, and sometimes in the ugly reality of statecraft, it must, then do it fast and move on. Don't linger. Don't enjoy it. Don't let it become the defining feature of your rule. Because a leader who governs through permanent terror isn't strong, he's desperate. The chameleon strategy is something else entirely. It's the understanding that no single approach works forever. Generosity works until people start expecting it and mistake it for weakness. Severity works until it creates resentment that festers into rebellion. Machiavelli argues that the greatest skill a leader can possess is the ability to oscillate, to know when kindness serves power and when firmness preserves order. This isn't a philosophy of evil, it's a philosophy of awareness. Machiavelli sees the world as fundamentally unstable. Alliances shift, populations grow restless, enemies probe for weakness, and in that world, rigidity is death. The leader who says, "This is who I am, take it or leave it," will be left, quickly, often violently. What Machiavelli actually advocates is something far more demanding than cruelty. He advocates intelligence, the kind that requires ego suppression, constant observation, and the willingness to abandon what worked yesterday if it won't work tomorrow. That's not the advice of a monster. That's the advice of a man who watched empires fall because their leaders refused to evolve.
Machiavelli doesn't sugarcoat human nature. He doesn't hedge. He doesn't offer a gentle disclaimer before delivering the blow. In chapter 17 of The Prince, he lays it out plain. Men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. And he says it not with contempt, not with bitterness, but with the calm precision of someone who's watched it happen 100 times over. And that's what makes it sting. Because most people, even the cynical ones, still carry around some quiet hope that people will do the right thing when it counts, that loyalty means something, that generosity will be returned. Machiavelli looks at that hope and doesn't mock it. He just says, don't build your strategy on it. He argues that a leader who assumes the best in people will be destroyed by those who assume nothing at all. It's not pessimism, it's pattern recognition. He'd spent years inside Florentine diplomacy. He'd watched alliances crumble overnight, seen men betray their patrons the moment the wind shifted. And he realized something that most political theorists of his era refuse to admit. Human behavior is not governed by ideals, it's governed by incentives. And that's the key distinction. Machiavelli doesn't say people are evil, he says they're self-interested.
There's a difference. Evil implies malice. Self-interest implies survival. And when you understand that, when you stop expecting people to act against their own interests out of some abstract sense of duty, you stop being surprised. You stop being vulnerable. He points out that when times are good, when there's no danger, everyone swears loyalty. Everyone's a friend. Everyone promises they'd die for the cause.
But the moment the threat arrives, the moment the cost of loyalty becomes real, most of them disappear. Not because they're wicked, but because self-preservation is the oldest instinct there is, and no oath, no contract, no handshake overrides it when the stakes are high enough. So what does he recommend? Cynicism? Paranoia? No, preparation. Machiavelli argues that a wise leader builds systems that don't depend on people's goodness. He designs incentives. He creates consequences. He makes loyalty the rational choice, not the sentimental one, because sentiment fades, but structure holds. A leader who relies on love alone, he warns, is standing on sand. Love is conditional. It shifts with mood, with circumstance, with the next better offer. But a well-constructed system of accountability, that endures. And here's the part people always leave out. He doesn't say fear is better than love as some kind of personal preference. He says that if a leader can't have both, and most can't, then fear is the more reliable tool. Not cruelty, not terror, fear. The kind that comes from knowing there are real consequences for betrayal. The kind that keeps order not through violence, but through the credible threat of it. He's not building a case for tyranny. He's building a case for realism. And the uncomfortable truth is, he's right more often than people want to admit. Look at any organization, any government, any institution that collapsed. Somewhere in the wreckage, you'll find a leader who trusted too much, who assumed loyalty would hold when the pressure came, who confused someone's words with their intentions. Machiavelli saw all of this 500 years ago. He wrote it down. And people called him a monster for it. But the ones who actually read him, the ones who understood what he was saying, they didn't call him a monster, they called him useful. Because knowing the truth about human nature isn't cruelty, it's the first step toward navigating it. Machiavelli understood something most people still don't, that being predictable isn't a personality trait, it's a vulnerability. He argues that a ruler who behaves the same way in every situation, always merciful, always aggressive, always cautious, becomes easy to manipulate. Because the moment your enemies know how you'll respond, they've already won half the battle. They don't need to outthink you. They just need to wait for you to do exactly what you always do, and then exploit it. This wasn't paranoia. This was pattern recognition. Machiavelli had watched it happen in real time. Leaders who built reputations on consistency became prisoners of that consistency. The generous ruler couldn't afford to say no, because saying no would shatter the image. The merciful ruler couldn't punish betrayal, because punishment would contradict the brand. And so they kept doing what people expected of them, long past the point where it served any strategic purpose. He warns that rigidity is not strength. It's the most dangerous form of weakness, because it looks like principle, it feels like integrity, but in practice, it hands your opponents a playbook. And Machiavelli was very clear. Your opponents are always reading. So what does he recommend? Adaptability, not as some vague personal growth concept, but as a tactical necessity. He argues that a prince must be capable of shifting between kindness and severity, between openness and secrecy, between war and diplomacy, depending on what the moment demands, not what his reputation demands, not what the public expects, what the situation actually requires. And this is where people get uncomfortable, because what Machiavelli's really saying is that moral consistency, the thing most people consider a virtue, can be a strategic liability. He's not telling rulers to abandon their values. He's telling them to stop letting their values make them stupid. He points out that fortune, his word for the unpredictable forces of circumstance, doesn't care about your character. It doesn't reward good men. It doesn't punish bad ones. It simply moves. And the ruler who can't move with it gets crushed. Machiavelli compares fortune to a river and flood. You can't stop it, but you can build levees before it rises. You can prepare. You can adapt. What you can't do is stand in the same place and expect the water to go around you because you're a decent person. That metaphor alone tells you everything about how his mind worked. He wasn't interested in what was fair. He was interested in what was survivable. And he makes a sharp distinction here between two types of leaders. The one who adapts, who reads the room, adjusts the approach, recalibrates when the terrain shifts. And the one who stays the course no matter what, because changing feels like weakness. Machiavelli argues the second type almost always fails, not because they lack courage, but because they confuse stubbornness with strength. And by the time they realize the difference, it's already too late. This is the part of Machiavelli that doesn't fit the villain narrative, because a villain wouldn't care about adaptability. A villain would want control, domination. Machiavelli wants something far more practical: survival, continuity, the ability to keep governing when everything around you is shifting. He doesn't ask rulers to be good. He doesn't ask them to be evil. He asks them to be awake, present, responsive to reality rather than loyal to an image of themselves that no longer serves them. And that's the part most people miss. Predictability isn't just a strategic flaw in Machiavelli's world. It's a death warrant signed by your own hand. This is the one that gets Machiavelli called a liar, a snake, a man without honor. And honestly, if you read one line out of context, you'd think they were right. He says a prince should not keep his word when keeping it works against him. That's the quote people remember. That's the line that turned his name into an insult. But the full argument, it's not about deception for its own sake. It's about survival in a world where nobody else is keeping their promises either. Machiavelli starts with a simple observation. There are two ways to fight, by law and by force. Law is the human way, force is the animal way, and he argues that a prince must know how to use both, not because he wants to, because the world demands it. When everyone around you is breaking their word, when alliances shift overnight, when treaties are signed in bad faith, When your enemies smile while sharpening their knives, rigid honesty isn't a virtue, it's a death sentence. He points to the fox and the lion. The lion can't protect itself from traps. The fox can't protect itself from wolves. So a prince must be both. Strong enough to intimidate, clever enough to see the trap before it closes. And that means, sometimes, telling people what they need to hear rather than what's technically true. But here's what the critics always leave out. Machiavelli doesn't celebrate this. He doesn't say lying is good. He says it's necessary. There's a difference, a massive one. He's describing the world as it is, not as anyone wishes it were. And in that world, Renaissance Italy, torn apart by invasions, betrayals, and papal scheming, a ruler who kept every single promise would not be admired. He'd be conquered. His people would suffer. His state would collapse. And his honesty would mean nothing to the citizens living under foreign occupation. So Machiavelli reframes the question. The real issue isn't whether a prince should break promises. It's which promises, and when, and for what reason. A broken promise that saves a city is not the same as a broken promise that enriches a tyrant. Context matters. Intention matters. Outcome matters. And Machiavelli insists that a ruler's first obligation is not to his own reputation for honesty. It's to the survival and welfare of his state. And he adds something that most people skip entirely. He warns that a prince must be a great pretender, not because deception is admirable, but because appearances govern politics. People judge by what they see, not by what is. So a ruler who breaks a promise must also know how to make it look justified, how to control the narrative, how to maintain the image of virtue, even when the reality is more complicated. That's not cynicism, that's political literacy. Machiavelli argues that the masses will always be won over by appearances and results. If a ruler keeps order, provides security, and delivers prosperity, the people will forgive a broken oath. But if a ruler keeps every promise and loses the state, nobody writes songs about that kind of integrity. This is what separates Machiavelli from a con artist. He's not teaching people how to cheat. He's teaching rulers how to govern in a world full of cheaters. He's saying, don't be the only honest man at a table of liars. You won't reform them. They'll devour you. And your people will pay the price for your principles. Machiavelli has a line that makes people deeply uncomfortable. He argues that when dealing with rivals, a prince must either win them over completely or eliminate them entirely. There is no middle ground. And people read that and recoil. They call it barbaric, psychopathic, the philosophy of a man who sees human beings as chess pieces. But they're not reading carefully enough. Machiavelli's target here isn't people, it's indecision, half measures, the cowardly middle path that politicians love because it lets them avoid hard choices while pretending they've made one. He warns that injuring an enemy, hurting them just enough to anger them but not enough to neutralize them, is the single most dangerous thing a leader can do. Because now you've created someone with both a grievance and the capability to act on it. Think about it. You slight a rival, demote them, publicly embarrass them. But you leave them standing. You leave them with their allies, their resources, their influence. What happens next? They don't forget. They don't move on. They plan. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, they strike back, harder, with nothing left to lose. Machiavelli saw this pattern repeat across centuries of Italian politics. The Borgias, the Medicis, the papal courts, leaders who tried to play nice with their enemies, who offered half pardons and partial concessions, who thought mercy without conviction would buy them loyalty. It never did. It bought them time, and not much of it. So when Machiavelli says love them or destroy them, he's not being theatrical, he's being precise.
He argues that genuine generosity, the kind that turns an adversary into a committed ally, is a legitimate and powerful strategy. Win someone over completely, and you gain not just their compliance, but their loyalty. That's valuable. That's durable. But if you can't do that, if the relationship is beyond repair, if the threat is real and reconciliation is a fantasy, then Machiavelli says, act decisively. Don't wound, don't warn, don't give speeches about consequences. Act, because a wounded enemy is more dangerous than a standing army. Now, here's what makes this genuinely uncomfortable. Machiavelli isn't wrong, and people know it. They've lived it in offices, in relationships, in politics. The passive-aggressive boss who disciplined you just enough to humiliate, but not enough to fire. The country that imposes sanctions too weak to deter, but strong enough to provoke. The friend who cuts you halfway out of their life and wonders why resentment builds. Half measures create enemies. Full commitment, in either direction, creates resolution. Machiavelli understood something that modern leadership culture still refuses to accept. Kindness without follow-through is manipulation, and punishment without conviction is provocation. Both are worse than doing nothing at all, because both create expectations that you then fail to meet. And unmet expectations, he argues, are the root of almost every political disaster in history. This is the part of Machiavelli that doesn't fit the villain narrative. A man obsessed with cruelty wouldn't spend chapters warning against unnecessary harm. A sadist wouldn't argue that the best outcome is turning your enemy into your friend. But Machiavelli does, repeatedly. He just refuses to pretend that friendship is always possible. And when it's not, he refuses to recommend the comfortable lie of a half response. The real evil, in Machiavelli's eyes, was never decisive action. It was the cowardice of doing just enough to feel virtuous while making everything worse. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. It should. Here's what people refuse to accept about Machiavelli. He didn't invent political deception. He just refused to pretend it wasn't there. Before him, political philosophy was a performance. Plato talked about philosopher kings. Aristotle talked about virtue. Cicero talked about duty. And all of it was beautiful, inspiring even. But none of it described what actually happened in the halls of power. None of it explained why good men lost and ruthless men won. None of it accounted for the gap between how leaders speak and how they act. Machiavelli looked at that gap, and instead of closing it with idealism, he walked right into it. He argues in The Prince that a leader must learn how not to be good, not because goodness is weakness, but because the political arena doesn't reward goodness consistently. It rewards effectiveness. And sometimes, often in fact, those two things are not the same. A ruler who keeps every promise, who tells the truth in every negotiation, who refuses to deceive even when survival demands it, that ruler doesn't last. Not because the world is fair and he failed, because the world isn't fair, and he refused to adapt. And this is what made Machiavelli dangerous. Not his ideas, his honesty. He describes politics as a stage, a place where appearance matters more than reality, where perception is power, where the leader who seems virtuous has more authority than the one who actually is virtuous but can't communicate it. He points out that people judge with their eyes, not their hands. They see what you appear to be. Very few get close enough to touch what you actually are, and of those few, none will dare contradict the opinion of the many. That's not cynicism, that's observation. And he wasn't wrong. Every political system in history, every single one, has operated on some version of this principle. Image management isn't a modern invention. It didn't start with television or social media. It started the moment the first leader realized that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the army. Machiavelli just had the nerve to say it out loud. He warns that a prince must be a great pretender and dissembler, and people read that line and recoil. They think he's celebrating dishonesty. But he's not celebrating anything. He's reporting. He's telling you what the job requires, not what it should require in some perfect world, but what it actually demands in this one. And there's a brutal clarity in that, a kind of respect for the reader that most political writers refuse to offer. Because the alternative is what? Pretending that honesty always wins? That transparent leaders always triumph? History doesn't support that. History is full of honest leaders who were outmaneuvered by those willing to play the game, full of idealists who lost everything because they wouldn't bend. Machiavelli looked at that pattern and decided his readers deserved the truth, even if the truth was ugly. And here's what's remarkable. He doesn't excuse any of it. He doesn't say deception is moral. He doesn't say lying is noble. He says it's necessary, under certain conditions, in certain moments, for certain outcomes. And he leaves the moral judgment to the reader. That's not the move of a villain. That's the move of a teacher who trusts you enough to let you draw your own conclusions. But the world didn't want a teacher. It wanted a scapegoat, someone to blame for the uncomfortable reality that politics has never, not once in human history, been a clean game. Machiavelli didn't dirty the water. He just told you it was never clean. There's a reason Machiavelli keeps getting filed under villainy. People read his words and hear permission to be cruel. But that's not what he's saying, not even close. Machiavelli argues that the most dangerous person in any power structure isn't the tyrant. It's the one who refuses to acknowledge that power has rules. The naive idealist who walks into a room full of wolves and expects handshakes. That person doesn't just lose. He drags everyone who depends on him down with him. And that's the core of his argument. Niceness, in the way most people practice it, isn't moral. It's passive. It's the absence of confrontation dressed up as virtue. Machiavelli saw through that. He points out that a ruler who cannot bring himself to act decisively, who hesitates, who appeases, who avoids conflict at every turn, isn't protecting anyone. He's just postponing the inevitable, and the longer he waits, the worse it gets. He uses Cesare Borgia as an example, and this is where people's eyes go wide, because Borgia was, by any modern standard, ruthless. But Machiavelli doesn't hold him up as a role model for cruelty. He holds him up as a case study in effectiveness. Borgia inherited chaos, lawless territories, warring factions, and he brought order, swiftly, brutally, yes, but the result was stability. The people who lived under that order were safer than they'd been in years. Machiavelli's point isn't that Borgia was good. His point is that Borgia's willingness to act, to be dangerous when the moment demanded it, produced better outcomes than the timid rulers who came before him and let everything rot. That distinction is everything, and it's the one that keeps getting erased. He warns that the world does not reward restraint, not in politics, not in leadership, not in any arena where power is contested. The restrained leader, Machiavelli argues, simply makes space for the unrestrained one. And when that unrestrained rival takes power, the restrained leader's principles won't save anyone, least of all the people who believed in him. So when Machiavelli says a prince must learn how not to be good, he's not endorsing immorality. He's describing a skill set, the capacity to act against your own instincts when circumstances demand it, to punish when you'd rather forgive, to deceive when transparency would be suicide, to be hard when softness would be interpreted as surrender. He's saying that goodness without capability is just vulnerability with better branding.
And here's what makes this so uncomfortable. Machiavelli isn't wrong. History is littered with leaders who were beloved and useless, who had the affection of their people and none of the competence to protect them, who were so committed to being seen as good that they couldn't do what was necessary. Machiavelli looked at those leaders and called it what it was, not virtue, cowardice in a pleasant disguise. He argues that true strength requires the willingness to be misunderstood, to be called a monster if it means the state survives, to carry a reputation for harshness if the alternative is collapse. He doesn't enjoy this. There's no glee in his writing, no celebration of violence, just a cold, steady recognition that the world punishes the unprepared far more than it punishes the ruthless. And that's the reading most people refuse to do. They stop at "be dangerous" and never get to "so that you can protect what matters." Machiavelli wasn't writing a manual for villains. He was writing a warning for the ones who thought goodness alone was enough. It never was. He just had the nerve to say it. Machiavelli doesn't guess. He studies, and history, over and over again, handed him the evidence he needed. He looks at leaders who were beloved, who were generous, who were merciful to a fault, and he watches them lose everything, not because they were bad rulers, but because they were soft ones. And softness in a world built on power is an invitation. Take the case he returns to repeatedly, Italy itself. In Machiavelli's lifetime, Italian city-states were ruled by princes who valued courtesy, art, diplomacy, and refined manners. They built beautiful courts, they patronized great painters, and they got steamrolled. France invaded, Spain invaded, the Holy Roman Empire treated the peninsula like a chessboard, and the refined, cultured, nice rulers of Italy, they either fled, surrendered, or died. Machiavelli argues that this wasn't bad luck. It was cause and effect. These rulers believed that goodwill would protect them, that loyalty was earned through kindness alone, that if they treated their subjects well and their neighbors fairly, they'd be safe. And every single one of them was wrong. He points to Cesare Borgia, a man most people consider a villain, brutal, ruthless, willing to crush anyone who stood in his way. But Machiavelli saw something else. He saw a ruler who pacified the Romagna, a region that had been lawless and chaotic for years. Borgia sent in Ramiro de Orco, a cruel enforcer, to establish order. And once order was restored, Borgia had de Orco publicly executed, cut in half and displayed in the town square to distance himself from the cruelty that had been done in his name. Cold, calculated, and devastatingly effective. The people got their peace, and Borgia got their loyalty. Now, compare that to someone like Piero de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He inherited Florence and had every advantage: wealth, name, legacy. And when the French army marched into Italy in 1494, what did he do? He surrendered almost immediately, gave away Florentine fortresses without a fight, tried to negotiate his way out of a crisis that required steel. The Florentines didn't thank him for avoiding bloodshed. They expelled him. He died in exile. His niceness cost him everything. Machiavelli's conclusion is blunt. A ruler who is feared, not hated, feared, holds power. A ruler who is merely loved gets tested. And when the test comes, love evaporates faster than anyone wants to admit. Fear stays. Fear is consistent. Fear doesn't change its mind when a better offer comes along. He's not endorsing tyranny. He says that plainly. Hatred is fatal. A ruler who is hated will eventually face a conspiracy he can't survive. But a ruler who is feared and respected, that's the combination that endures. And Machiavelli argues that if you have to choose, if you absolutely cannot have both, fear is safer than love.
Because people will betray someone they love the moment it serves their interest, but they'll think twice about betraying someone they fear.
History kept proving him right, long after his death. Louis XVI was loved. He lost his head. Nicholas II was gentle. He lost his dynasty. And the rulers who lasted, Augustus, Elizabeth I, Bismarck, they understood exactly what Machiavelli was saying. Kindness without strength is weakness wearing a mask.
Machiavelli doesn't hate nice people. He just knows what happens to them in politics. They finish last, and their people finish with them.